And we'll wait another minute or two and see if we get some folks online, because I'm a little concerned about Zoom. It's not acting right. No one has emailed to say that it is a problem. So maybe it's just my imagination. That's all I see. Okay. I'm going to assume that all is well. All right, so we're moving into 18th century to the classical period now. We started with the medieval Middle Ages period, moved into the Renaissance, and then through the Baroque. Now we're in the classical period. You know, lots of people say classical music as kind of a catch-all phrase, but classical period itself is from about 1700 to about 1810. So it's a lot more narrow than that. What we listened to the previous 2 weeks, many people would call that classical music, but technically it's not, it's Baroque. It's from the Baroque period. So when you say classical, hi Chloe, when you say classical, that is kind of a catch-all phrase, but it's sort of like saying Kleenex. No matter what kind of tissue you purchase, we call it Kleenex. But if it's not actual Kleenex brand, then it's not really Kleenex. So what we're going to be hearing for the next couple of weeks is actual, honest to goodness, classical music. So here's kind of our little timeline. Louis XIV dies in 1715, and the reign of Louis XV begins. That's, of course, in France. Joseph Haydn, who is a looming figure in the classical period, is born in 1732. George Washington is born the same year. Antonio Vivaldi, remember he was a virtuoso violinist, wrote the Four Seasons, dies in 1741. And in 1751, Benjamin Franklin is experimenting with electricity. He did not discover electricity or invent electricity, he just experimented with it. Did he put a key on a kite string? Maybe. That's somewhat apocryphal. That may not have actually happened, but he did do a lot of experimentation. Benjamin Franklin was a writer and an inventor and a thinker. In 1763, young Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart is touring all over Europe with his sister Nannerl and his father, wowing crowds, and mostly in palaces that had a lot of money, with his musical skill. The first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which was an actual volume written down, bound leather book, set of leather books for a long, long time, was published in 1771. And in 1775, the American Revolutionary War begins. In 1785, Schiller writes the words for Ode to Joy, not the music, that's going to be Beethoven, but he writes the poem that is used for Ode to Joy. The French Revolution begins in 1789. Mozart dies in 1791 at about 35 years of age. Beethoven writes the Moonlight Sonata, very familiar piece of music. And then Napoleon is crowned Emperor of France in 1804. Classicism is a movement of order and reason. Order and reason and logic. And classicism's inspiration, I guess, for lack of a better word, is ancient Greek and Roman society. Ancient Greek and Roman society kind of laid the foundation for democracies later on, sort of created the ideals which make up European identity and by default American identity too, because we sprang from European ideals. The ideals of classicism have repeatedly resurfaced throughout the centuries and in some cases have coexisted with other stylistic concerns. Balance and symmetry are highlights of classicism, of classical architecture, of classical art, and of classical music. They remember Baroque was grotesque and highly decorated. Classicism is exactly the opposite of that. It's much more streamlined and follows a more strict set of rules. This time period was known as the Enlightenment. When we were moving away from religious ideals and more toward humanistic ideals, we were interested in philosophy, science, and intellectual movement. Human reason, using your brain instead of your heart, was important in the Enlightenment. Artists and musicians strove to join the social push toward order and reason, which when we think of artists, we think of them being more freewheeling and more, well, this is not a contemporaneous term, but more bohemian. But that wasn't what was going on in the Enlightenment, at least not in the beginning. Now, when we start with Haydn, he is much more of an enlightened figure. He is all about order and following the rules. Mozart's going to push that boundary, and then Beethoven is going to smash it into little bitty pieces. We were interested in things like natural simplicity, not being overly decorated and busy just for the sake of being overly decorated and busy. Hi, Kira.
Hi, sorry.
It's okay, just glad to see you. So here's an example of some classical architecture or ancient Roman architecture that is emulated by classical architecture. This is the Pantheon in Rome. This is a shrine to many gods. And what is interesting about this is if you could pull back and we could stand where they took this picture, you'd be right in front of a McDonald's. I've been to the Pantheon and there's a McDonald's right here. In fact, the steps, this porch at the Pantheon had hundreds of people sitting eating their Big Macs right here because it was a really hot day in August. But notice that it's balanced. You can draw a line right down the middle of this building and it's symmetrical on this side and this side. Everything is orderly and it has symmetry. That's very much a classical proportion, very much a classical ideal. The classical era in music encompasses the last half of the 18th century and the early decades of the 19th, so 1750 to 1825. So not as long, certainly, as the Middle Ages, which seemed to go on forever and ever. Not as long as the Renaissance. Time is tightening up. It was an era of strong aristocratic sovereigns and rulers, but it was also a time of revolution. The American Revolution and the French Revolution took place during this time period. Louis XV was in the palace at Versailles, which we saw last time, very ornate, lots of expensive stuff going on there. Frederick the Great in Prussia, Maria Theresa in Austria, and Catherine the Great in Russia. Most of those names should be familiar to you. The ruling class ruled by hereditary right. It was passed down from generation to generation in the same families. And those families tended to intermarry as well. if you wanted to solidify your power and be sure that you were gonna get along with the Germans, you made sure that one of your kids married somebody from the German court skin. And that way your families were intertwined and you wouldn't go to war against each other. That was a good way to ensure peace. You know, sometimes they didn't work out because not everybody always gets along, but that was the idea at least. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution is going to begin, which wasn't really a revolution of power struggle. It was a revolution of invention and creating machines that could make, not necessarily replace humans, but could make humans more productive and make humans' jobs easier because the machine can take some of the load off. Some of the things that were invented or improved were the steam engine by James Watt, very important in travel, the spinning jenny, and the cotton gin. Those were all very important advances and inventions in this time period. And we were very interested in science. I already mentioned Benjamin Franklin, figuring out things about electricity. Joseph Priestley discovered oxygen, and Edward Jenner perfected vaccination. Really important. Intellectual life, such as the publication of the French Encyclopedia and the first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. We call the 18th century the Age of Reason or the Age of Enlightenment. Those are kind of interchangeable terms. Philosophers thought deep thoughts about social and political issues, and they used reason and science to think about it. They didn't lead from the heart, they led from the head. But they were also advocates for the rising middle class that were being affected by that Industrial Revolution. The intellectual climate was nourished by two opposing streams. Classical art captured exquisite refinement of a way of life that was coming to a close. And it also caught the first wave of a new social structure that was going to lead to all those revolutions that I was just talking about. Now, we just saw the Pantheon, right? So here is the rotunda at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville that was designed by Thomas Jefferson. Again, we can draw a line right down the center and you see the balance and the symmetry in this building. So this is a direct callback to that Roman architecture that we saw in the Pantheon. They were trying to emulate that look and that balance and that structure. 18th century thinkers idealized the civilizations of the Greeks and Romans. And artists revered the unity and proportions of ancient architecture and of fine art. Thomas Jefferson patterned the nation's capital, the University of Virginia that we just saw, and his home at Monticello. Those were all emulations of Greek and Roman temples. His example spurred on a classical revival in the United States, which made Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian columns features of public buildings. We still see those being used today. We're talking about these columns like this. And I will be honest with you, I don't remember the difference between Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian. It has to do with whether there's stuff at the top and the bottom. And I don't remember. That's not something my brain has stored. By the 1760s, a romantic point of view was beginning to emerge in literature. Remember that when we have an artistic movement, it's not just in one art, it's in every art. If it's happening in literature, it's going to happen in music. If it's happening in music, it's going to happen in painting, drawing, and sculpture. These things move like waves on the ocean. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was called the father of Romanticism, which is where we're going to go next. And he was a French philosopher. One of his celebrated ideas is man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. Meaning that we should all have freedom, but not everybody is free. Some people are more free than others. And this was very true at this time because, in the United States, we're not the United States yet, we're still the colonies, but everywhere in what would become the United States, we had people enslaved who were doing labor for free. So that's very true of us right now. The first manifestation of the Germans of Romantic spirit in Germany was a literary movement known as Sturm und Drang, storm and stress. They were very dramatic. Let's just call it that. It was very dramatic. Everything was heightened in drama, was heightened in emotion, which is not something we did as much during the classical period. So once we get to the Sturm und Drang, we know that things are changing because all of a sudden people were emoting, and that wasn't done up to that point. Two characteristic works in the 1770s were The Sorrows of Young Werther, which was a novel by Goethe. Goethe was a favored poet of the Romantics. Many of them set poems by Goethe to music, and The Robbers by Schiller, by von Schiller. Von Schiller is the Ode to Joy guy. So by the time we get down to the end of the classical period and we're moving into the Romantic period, society has kind of been turned upside down and given a good shake. The United States is now an independent nation. The French have kicked out the aristocracy and the monarchy and have gone to being a republic. Everything's been turned on its ear by the time we get through the classical period and we move into the Romantic. The classical period of music is characterized by the masters of the Viennese school, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, and then their successor, Franz Schubert, who we actually think of as a Romantic composer. These composers worked in an age of great musical experimentation and discovery when musicians took on new challenges. They wanted to thoroughly explore the possibilities offered by the major and minor scale system, and they wanted to perfect a large-scale instrumental form known as sonata form that they would use for their symphonies. Symphonies are going to become much longer and more involved by the time Beethoven is writing his. That's why he only wrote 9, because Haydn wrote several hundred, Beethoven wrote 9, because Beethoven's take much more than an hour to play. Once they found the ideal sonata structure, they then developed it into solo and duo sonatas, the trio and the quartet, the concerto and the symphony. So this sonata form is going to be super important, and it's going to permeate most of what's going on in instrumental music in the classical period. Let's take a look at this glass harmonica. This was invented by Beethoven, and it's water glasses. And you would fill these water glasses to certain heights, and they are also slightly different sizes. It's kind of hard to see that because we can't really see down into the harmonica. But you would wet your fingers and then you would run them around the rims of the glasses, and that created music. Let me see if I can find quickly the glass harmonica that spins, because I think that one makes more sense to me. Here's another glass harmonica. Let's just hear this play.
The thing that's different about a bigger vacation is you always have.
Benjamin Franklin saw someone place water-tuned wine glasses and thought that this would be a more convenient arrangement. He wanted to do away with the water tuning and wanted to have a lot more glasses and be able to play more than 2 at a time. So, voila, one of Franklin's favorite inventions. So these are all wine glass, basically custom blown wine glasses, and they're all nested inside of each other. And the whole assembly is turning, so you can play it somewhat candlelight. Here's a little bit from the Lucia.
So before he plays, if you look at the gold bands, these are sort of set up like a piano keyboard. You know, on a piano keyboard, you have white keys, and then you have 2 black keys together, and then some white keys, and then 3 black keys together, and then some white keys. So that's what the gold bands are for, is to kind of help you figure out where you are. If this was a piano keyboard, this would be a C, you know. The glass bowl that's just below the ones that are spinning, that has water in it. You have to have your fingers moist, or this doesn't work. I apologize if you don't like the word.
Those are also.
See, he's gonna wet his fingers.
Solo piece that you.
I think that's really cool. So this is how it started out, you know, those, how it started, how it's going. This is how it started, and the video we just saw is how it's going. So, that was invented by Ben Franklin, and then Mozart and Beethoven wrote music for it. See how interconnected everything is. Classicism did not imply a strict adherence to traditional form. The composers of the Viennese school are going to experiment, they're going to try stuff. Like I said, Haydn's going to stick more to the rules, Mozart's going to bend them, and Beethoven's going to break them. And that's just kind of the natural progression of things. The minuet was a popular dance. Here is a painting of a minuet and the trees. So they're out at a garden party dancing. Classical music is all about the melody, the tune. All of these Viennese composers could write a beautiful, lyrical, wonderful, memorable tune. In fact, some of their melodies are the most recognized melodies in the history of Western music. Mozart wrote, well, you know, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, that's a Mozart tune. Beethoven wrote Ode to Joy, which we recognize is universally recognized, even if you don't know the actual German text. Haydn wrote the Surprise Symphony, which is often played by young aspiring piano players. And a lot of this music, a lot of their music is played in cartoons. They use a lot of truly classical tunes in cartoons, and they alter them and change them a little bit for whatever's going on in the action of the cartoon. But the actual tunes themselves often come from this time period. They are usually based on symmetrical 4-bar phrases, and they have clear-cut cadences so that you kind of know when one phrase is ending and the next phrase begins. It's easy to tell when you're moving from section to section. They will move stepwise, or small leaps within a narrow range. So we're not to the point where we're gonna have huge leaps yet. That's gonna come as we move into Romanticism and into the 20th century. Clarity is very important to Viennese composers. They want the music to be clear and understandable. So they often repeat or use imitation in their phrasing. And a frequent use of sequence, when you use the same pattern at a higher or lower pitch. These devices make for very balanced structure, because remember, we're all about balance and symmetry right now. Harmonies are clear and nothing too weird. We're not gonna, we have basic major and minor tonality. So they're firmly rooted in the key. They're not gonna go to weird, strange places or be what we call aleatoric music that is not rooted in a key center. That's gonna come later. We're not there yet. The chords underline the balanced symmetry of phrases and cadences. So there's a lot of homophonic texture here where the chords are supporting the melody. Music is in the basic meters: 2/4, 2 beats in a measure, 3/4, 3 beats in a measure, 4/4, 4 beats in a measure, or 6/8 time. 6/8 time is 6 beats in a measure, but it's based on the 8th note instead of on the quarter note. It's often conducted in 2. But you think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's easy for listeners to mix up 6/8 and 3/4 time when they hear them, if they don't see the music itself, because they sound and feel pretty similar to one another. It moves at a steady tempo. We're not going to have a lot of speeding up and slowing down, but there will be some. If a piece or a movement begins at a certain meter, it's probably going to stay there. We're not going to change from 2/4 to 3/4 or from 3/4 to 4/4 in the middle of a piece. We're going to do that later, but we're not there yet. Rhythm works closely with melody and harmony to make the phrases clear and to establish the cadences on time. So no real weird rhythmic things. There will be a lot of 8th note runs and melismas, especially in vocal music, but they're not gonna break outside of these established meters. It's gonna stay within the meter itself. There are clearly defined sections, which is part of sonata form, and if they stray from the key where they began, they're going to come back to that key. If they move, they're going to move to a closely related key. They're not going to go someplace strange and exotic and really weird away from the home key. And they're going to come back. We're going to come back at ABA, where you have the A section and the B section that's a little different, and then you come back to the A section. That's gonna reign supreme in the classical period. Music of the classical period used a lot of folk and popular elements. This was felt in dance suites, minuets, waltzes, but also in songs, symphonies, concertos, string quartets, and sonatas. Remember that this humanistic time, they were concerned about the middle class, the common folks. So a way to incorporate concern for the common folks was to absorb the music that they would listen to and enjoy and put it into more aristocratic settings. The patronage system was how musicians made their money in the classical period. Patronage is basically sponsorship. You find a wealthy member of society who likes what you do, and they become your patron, they become your sponsor, and they pay you to compose or sing or play or do whatever it is that you do. And that's how you made your money, was by having a patron, or more than one. Now that meant that the patron also gets to tell you what to do. If they are paying you and they need music for their party on next Friday night, then you write music for their party next Friday night. Whether you really care about their party or not, that's what you do, that's your job. So the aristocracy viewed arts as a necessary part of life. If you were wealthy, you were expected to be a patron to artists and musicians and help to cultivate those arts, it was part of the aristocratic lifestyle. Music was part of the elaborate lifestyle of the nobility. And remember, this is still not a time when after dinner you're gonna go in and turn on Netflix. You would, if you were wealthy enough, you had not just a court composer, but you had your own orchestra, your own opera company, or, you know, you had folks that were on your staff who you paid to be your entertainment. Social events at court created a steady demand for new works from composers. Haydn is going to spend his entire life under patronage. Mozart is going to chafe under patronage. He wants to be able to do his own thing without anybody telling him what to write or what not to write. He is not going to be entirely successful, spoiler alert. Beethoven, however, is going to come along and kind of undo the patronage system and find ways to be a successful paid musician that don't involve necessarily working for one specific patron. He is going to succeed where Mozart was not successful. He's going to break out of that. And that's why Mozart and Beethoven are both great heroes to the next generation of composers for exactly opposite reasons. Mozart, because he struggled so hard to be his own person and failed, and so they see him as a beautiful tragedy, and Beethoven, because he struggled and succeeded, and they see him as a great success. There were opportunities for women to be successful, usually as singers or performers. In Italy and France, professional female singers achieved prominence in opera and in court ballets. Now, this is a bit of a departure because before, the higher parts that we would normally think of as being sung by females were sung by boys or were sung by castrati. But now we have actual, honest to goodness, females on the stage. Others found a place within aristocratic circles, like being court instrumentalists and music teachers. And they would teach private lessons to members of the nobility or their children. Aristocratic women who had time liked to study music as well. And so if you had a patron and his wife wanted to learn how to play the harpsichord, you would probably be the one teaching Mrs. Rich Lady to play the harpsichord. Two women in particular who were both associated with Mozart stand out as impressive keyboard players. His sister, Maria Anna Mozart, who in the family was called Nannerl, was an accomplished piano player, and she toured with her brother, Wolfgang, when they were children. Their father took them all over Europe and showed them off. And then a friend of Mozart's, who was a blind composer, Maria Teresa von Paradis, was also an excellent pianist and organist. And she was renowned for her musical memory. She could remember 60 different concertos by memory. And that's a lot of music. And later on, we'll talk about Marianne Martinez. So here's a map of Europe during this time, and all these cities are centers of musical importance at the time. Remember, just not that long ago, it was Rome and London and Vienna. But now look at all these other places that are becoming important too. So things are opening up. You don't have to live in Rome to be a successful musician anymore. You don't have to go to Vienna. You can go to any of these other places and make a living. Now, music has always been in the palace and the court. But now, music is going to move into the public concert hall. And this is because of that rising middle class, spurred on by the Industrial Revolution. They had leisure time and they had money, so they could go and hear public concerts. They could go and hear a Haydn oratorio. They could go to a concert that was being presented in public by Mozart or Beethoven. And the public flocked to hear this stuff. You know, today we go to stadium tours and we pay big bucks to see people perform. So it's not that strange to us that people would want to go and hear these very important musicians do their thing. That makes sense to us. But it was kind of a new idea. Music had been, had been sort of held back from the general public because they didn't have time and they didn't have money to spend. And so the place for composers and musicians to make their money was in the palace or the court. But now they also had the opportunity to make money from the common people who could come and pay to hear them perform. And that's a big change. It's also going to change the music that is being performed. Mozart's going to go from writing Italian style opera that was meant in its inception to be performed at court, and he's going to move into writing things that were more for the public theater, that were funnier, that had more elaborate and outlandish plots, and often used popular music as the foundation for some of the things that he wrote, because people would recognize that. Kind of, like Weird Al Yankovic. He takes a song that we all recognize and he changes it up to be funny. Mozart did that too. So the public is going to eat that up. If Mozart had lived longer, he would have been a very financially successful composer. He died penniless and was buried in a pauper's grave. We're not even sure where exactly he was buried because they couldn't afford to bury him in his own plot. He was basically thrown in a big hole in the ground with a bunch of other dead people. And we have really no idea where he was buried because they couldn't afford to bury him properly. If he had lived a little bit longer, though, his comic operas were really catching on with the public, and he would have been financially successful if he had just survived a little bit longer. So let's talk about Papa Haydn. Why couldn't Beethoven find his piano teacher? Because he was Haydn. Yeah, Haydn gave the young Ludwig von Beethoven piano lessons. He actually did, and was a teacher of composition to young Beethoven. Haydn and classical chamber music. Remember, chamber music is music that is meant to be performed in a smaller space, not the big concert hall, but a more intimate space, like your dining room in your home. This form is the most important organizing element in absolute music. Absolute music is music which has no specific plot or story. It's just music for music's sake. It's music to be beautiful, or music to be scary, or music to be loud, or music to be danced to. But it doesn't tell any specific story or have any specific plot line. Musical ideas or themes are used as building blocks in compositions. These themes are made up of short, melodic, or rhythmic fragments known as motives. They're kind of like the Legos that you put together to create longer pieces of music. Themes can be expanded by varying the melody, rhythm, or harmony through thematic development. So you come up with a theme, you come up with a musical idea, and then you change it, you vary it, so that it's not quite the same the second and third time, but you can still tell that it was based on this idea. This is a red Lego, and then you use the same style of Lego, but it's blue, green, or yellow. But it's still the same size, it's still the same shape, and you can tell that they sort of belong together. The classical era is the golden age of chamber music. The specific definition of chamber music is ensemble music for 2 to 10 performers with one player per part. Now remember, this is because it's in a smaller space. You can't fit a symphony orchestra in your dining room unless you have a really big dining room. But you could probably put two to 10 people there if it's a big enough space. So chamber music was built for those more intimate settings. The string quartet is the most important chamber music genre of this era. String quartets consist of 2 violins, a viola, and a cello. What's missing? Double bass. Double bass was not part of the string quartet. Again, probably for size, for space. So you can fit 2 violins, a viola, and a cello, because the only person who really technically has to sit down is the cello player. Everybody else would stand up. The finale of Joseph Haydn's Joke Quartet features a playful tune that occurs as a refrain in rondo form. We're going to talk a little bit more extensively about rondo form. And here they talk about, you get together with some friends, begin a conversation on a topic of common interest. Folks will agree and disagree. You'll argue. You'll try to keep it friendly. And the idea was to come to a satisfactory conclusion. This is how 18th century Europeans understood chamber music, that it was kind of a conversation, it was a discussion, it was putting all the instruments together and everything kind of got to have its own say. Themes. A melodic idea uses a basic building block in the construction of a piece. It's also called the subject. But when we talked about fugues, we talked about the subject. And that's what a theme, that's what a theme is. It's the main musical idea on which a larger piece is built. We develop those themes, thematic development. You can change the melody slightly, you can change the harmony, or you can change the rhythm. That can also be thought of as the transformation of the theme. So the motive is the smaller musical idea. You put those together to create your theme. So when you take those and you can treat them in sequence, where you state your theme or your motive, and then you will repeat it at a higher or a lower pitch level. If you remember that video that we saw of the fugue, that happened over and over again in the little fugue that we saw. That is not a brand new classical idea. It's just something that's going to be seized upon and used a lot. Bach did it first. And remember, Bach was the textbook. Bach was the idea that this is how things should be done. So, since Bach did it, these composers are going to do it too. They're going to change it up by the time we get to Beethoven and Schubert, but the idea of sequence and repeating that thematic idea at a higher or lower pitch level is not brand new. Here's the Esterházy Palace in Hungary. This is where Joseph Haydn was employed. And again, if you could draw a line right down the center, what do you see? Okay, we're missing those big Roman columns here. There's some right here and some right here and some right here, but it doesn't take up the entire frontage of this palace because it's too big, frankly. It's really big. And this is where Haydn did most of his composing and spent most of his life. Okay, here they're talking about the fugue by Bach and how he saw the musical structure and saw the sequence. This kind of thing also happens in jazz. You know, it's an idea that continues to be used and continues to be explored. So, absolute music that does not have a literary, dramatic, or pictorial program or association. It's pure music. It's music for music's sake. A lot of most instrumental works in the classical period are multi-movement cycles. 3 or 4 movements, so 3 or 4 large parts This was especially true of the symphony, sonata, concerto, and chamber music. Each movement has its own tempo and form, and sometimes it's called a sonata cycle. So here's the general idea behind a multi-movement cycle. And in this case, well, they're talking about several. The first movement is long and dramatic, and it's at an allegro tempo, which means that it's going to move along. The second movement is slow and lyrical, so it's an andante or adagio tempo, and it's an A-B-A. Theme and variation. So they present the idea, change it up, and come back to the basic idea. The third movement is the optional movement. It's usually a more dance-like, an allegro or an allegretto. It could be a minuet and trio, or a scherzo and trio. Scherzo is another type of folk dance. So remember, third is optional, but the fourth, or the last, if you don't have four, is lively and spirited, allegro or vivace, and it's again a sonato, allegro, or rondo or sonata form. So you're going to have fast, slow, dance-like if you have a third movement, and then quite fast. So we're going to end up coming back to fast after a slow movement. Some symphonies and other long forms are going to have this third movement, some are not. And again, you can see there's our symmetry. We started with a fast piece, we end with a fast piece. In the middle, we have the slower stuff. Two simple forms, two-parter binary, which is AB, and three-parter ternary, ABA, where we come back to the original idea. Multi-movement classical works close with a rondo. And by the way, rondo, for those of you watching the recording, rondo is your code word this week, rondo. A rondo is a musical form in which the first section happens several times in the tonic key. And then it's going to go into the B section, it's going to come back to A, it's going to go back to B. So you've got a variety of choices here. See, can I pop that up there? Will it stay? No. Okay. What's important is that it's always going to come back to the A section. It can go A, B, A, B, A. Or instead of the second B, you have a C. A, B, A, C, A. But again, it's come back to A. Or A, B, A, C, A, B, A. Again, it's come back to A. So you can stretch it out, or you can have little shorter motives, but it's always going to come back to that A section. Its simplest form for rondo is A, B, A, C, A. So the B section and the C section would be different from one another and different from the A section. The ear listens for the return of that A section. In today's vernacular, we think of this as verse, chorus, verse, bridge, verse. If you're writing a pop song. So that's not too far off the mark either from what Mozart and Beethoven were doing. Chamber music, remember, 2 to 10 players, 1 player per part. Here is a watercolor of some chamber musicians. Notice that they're in kind of a small-ish room. You could not put a whole symphony orchestra in here. I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 performers and then some folks listening. And this is a string quartet. So we have 2 violins. Here's the cello player. The violins are sitting across from each other, although that really looks like a viola to me. Maybe these 2 are the violin players, because that's pretty big. I think that's the viola. The string quartet was the dominant form of chamber music in the classical period. Now, because you had these different sizes of string instruments that could play in different ranges, you could have 4-part harmony very easily, even without a bass. The cello serves as the bass. The 2 violins can play 2 different notes, and then the viola would play the 3rd part, and then the cello would serve as the bass. So you could have beautiful 4-part harmony with just these 4 players. Sometimes you would add to this string quartet, you could add a piano. That's a duo sonata, violin and piano, or cello and piano. A piano trio, which is violin, cello, and piano. And a quintet, which usually combines string and wind instruments. But again, you got to keep it under 10 players so you can fit in people's rooms. String accompaniment with solo instruments such as a piano or clarinet was also a common form of chamber music. The string quartet was intended to be enjoyed by a small group of music lovers. Composers didn't use big, expansive gestures. This was a more intimate setting, and so the writing was more intimate. The writing was more controlled and not quite as big and grandiose as the symphonies are going to become. Joseph Haydn wrote 68 string quartets. One of his quartets is the Joke Quartet. Haydn was known for his great sense of humor, and he was really well liked by his patron, so he got away with stuff that other people might not have been able to get away with. One of his symphonies is called the Farewell Symphony, because when your patron goes to the countryside for the summer, everybody goes, all the musicians go, the composer goes, the staff goes, everybody goes. And they had been in the countryside for months, and it was getting on toward fall. They really wanted to go back into the city because that's where their families were. You know, they're out here in the countryside. I'm sure it's very beautiful, but they'd like to go home and see their wives and children. And so Haydn wrote a symphony to get the point across. In the last movement of the symphony, one by one, the musicians stand up and bow and say, Auf Wiedersehen, and walk off the stage until there's one violin player left who stands up and bows and says, Auf Wiedersehen, and walks off the stage, which was getting the point across to his patron that, hey, let's go back to the city. All these guys just walked off the stage. They're trying to tell you something. Other people would have gotten in a lot of trouble for that, but Haydn didn't, because he was really well loved by his patron, and he could get away with that kind of thing. Okay. Haydn wrote the most of his string quartets in sets of 6, and the Joke Quartet is Opus 33. He dedicated this set to the Grand Duke Paul of Russia, who was the son of Catherine the Great, after a visit to Vienna by that nobleman. And while he was visiting, several of Haydn's quartets were the featured entertainment, and Paul really dug it, thought it was really cool. So Haydn wrote a set of quartets dedicated to him. This often happened. You would write something and dedicate it to a visitor or someone important. Later on, Beethoven is going to write a symphony that he's originally going to dedicate to Napoleon, and then he's going to rip that page up after he gets upset with Napoleon, who declared himself emperor, and Beethoven didn't like that. So then he just dedicates it to heroes. It becomes the Eroica Symphony. Haydn was one of the most prolific composers of the classical period. He was born in a small village, so he knew a lot about folk songs and dances, but he had a beautiful voice as a boy, and that helped him to become a choir boy at St. Stephen's in Vienna. See if we can see. There's Papa Haydn sitting at the harpsichord. When he was 29, Haydn entered the service of the Esterházys. They were the ones with that really big palace that we just saw in Hungary, and they were well known for their patronage of the arts. He lived and worked for them for almost 30 years. That's a long run. The family palace of Esterhazy was one of the most splendid in Europe, and music was central to the constant festivities that were going on there. The musical establishment under Haydn's direction included an orchestra, an opera company, a marionette theater, and a chapel. So he was very busy. He had a foot in every one of these little genres. He wrote music for the orchestra, he wrote operas, he wrote music for the marionette theater. Marionettes are puppets, in case you don't know that word. And he wrote religious music, sacred music for the chapel. By the time he reached middle age, his music had brought him a lot of fame. He was well known all over Europe. After the prince died, he made 2 visits to England, and he conducted his works with great success. He died in 1809, and he was revered throughout Europe by the time of his death. So this list of major works, kind of mind-blowing. Chamber music, 68 string quartets, over 100 symphonies, concertos for violin, piano, harpsichord, and trumpet, sacred vocal masses, including the Creation, which is very performed today, 14 operas, and lots of keyboard music, including sonatas. Okay, let's hear some. Hi. This is the string quartet, opus 33. This is the 4th movement of the Joke Symphony. So, remembering what we just heard, the tempo is going to be lively. It's going to be fast. And it's on this little theme that's supposed to sound like music from the countryside. Peasant theme, they say. So it comes back again, just like it was in the beginning. It's a new idea. And you can hear that repetition of the idea at the higher and lower pitch level. And we go back to the A theme. A section. On a program. which is different material. So just when you think it's over. This is the joke part. Because you think it's over. It's not over. It's still not over. So you can almost imagine the audience going, should I clap now? Should I clap now? And that's the joke part. That's the joke part of the joke. So symphonies are for larger groups, for orchestras. Symphony is a genre designed to demonstrate the expressive capabilities of the full orchestra, where we just heard a string quartet, which was, a much smaller group of people. But the symphony is going to let the entire orchestra have its say. It's one of the most important instrumental traditions during the classical era. Remember, Haydn wrote 100 of them, Beethoven wrote 9, Mozart wrote 40-ish. So as we move through this period of time, the symphony is going to become more involved, more elaborate, and longer, frankly, because they're just going to say more. Beethoven's going to have a lot to say when his symphonies come along. The heart of the classical orchestra, which at this time is about 30 or 40 players, now it's closer to 100. The heart was the strings. It's assisted by woodwinds, brass, and percussion. But the strings are the heart of the orchestra. They are the largest section in the orchestra, and that's still true today. We have more string players than we do woodwinds, brass, or percussion in our modern symphony orchestras. Joseph Haydn wrote over 100 symphonies, and among these, his last 12 were called the London Symphonies. Remember, he went to England toward the end of his life after the prince had died, and he wrote these London Symphonies while he was there. You have a lot more tone colors available to you as a composer if you're writing for orchestra. Because if you're writing for string quartet, you've got, 4 string players. But if you're writing for orchestra, you've got lots of strings, you've got basses in your string section now, you've got woodwind colors, you've got brass, and you have percussion. So that allows you to expand your palette, just like if you're a painter and you only have red, blue, and green, but all of a sudden now you have yellows and you have purples and you have browns and you have pinks. You have all these other colors you can paint with, and so you can do things that are more elaborate and more even perhaps interesting because you have so much more color. During the classical era, the notion of the orchestra as the ultimate instrument began to develop because it was all these voices that spoke as one. Composers sought to realize their greatest expressive potential through the medium of the symphony and writing for the symphony orchestra. It remains today, even as it has changed over the centuries, probably the most versatile and powerful musical resource of the Western tradition. The classical orchestra and the symphony are tied together. The classical masters established the orchestra as we know it today, an ensemble of the 4 instrumental families. The heart of the orchestra is the string family. Woodwinds provide varying colors and assist the strings, often doubling the parts that the strings play. And the brass sustained the harmonies and contributed to the body of the sound. And the timpani, which was the source of percussion during this time, supplied rhythmic life and vitality. In the 1700s, the orchestra numbered from 30 to 40 players. So you're not going to be able to put them in your dining room. They're going to have to go into the concert hall. Classical composers created a dynamic style of orchestral writing in which all instruments participated actively and each timbre could be heard. It was like a witty conversation. And this is the symphony. The large, which is a large work for orchestra, generally in 3 or 4 movements. Remember, the third movement is optional. You can have it or you cannot have it. The symphony had its roots in the Italian opera overture. Remember, an overture was the first piece that kind of gave you a little snippet of all the things you were going to hear later on. Right now in my little world, we're playing, I'm in the orchestra for the Little Mermaid play that's being done at Central, which is a combination of Central and Farmington people. And the overture that we play has little pieces of all the songs you're going to hear throughout the whole show put into one piece. An orchestral piece is in 3 sections: fast, slow, and fast. Remember, you can have that extra movement right here if you choose to. It was first played to introduce an opera, and then these 3 sections eventually became their own separate movements. It was the use of a quick, aggressive, rhythmic theme rising from low to high register with such speed that it became a rocket theme. So they would go from low notes to high notes, and they'd go there really fast. And they would, so they'd have almost like a melismatic passage that would take you from low registers of the instrument to the high registers. And this was very exciting to audiences because it made you feel like you were rising with the music. Crescendos is when it gets louder. It was called a steamroller effect because this was particularly connected to the court at Mannheim, Germany, which was called a Mannheim steamroller. You may have heard of a group of musicians, modern musicians, known as Mannheim steamroller. And it would get louder and louder and louder as they built toward the climax. And this, of course, was also very exciting for audiences because this was something kind of new. We hadn't had that capability in our instruments up until this time period. Remember, that started happening in the Baroque, and it continued with our innovations and our improvements in our instrument building in the classical period. So that was very exciting to hear that live. If you've never actually heard something like that live, it is pretty darn cool. See, there was something I was going to, and I've completely forgotten what it was. Darn. Oh, I know what it was. Okay. Oops, that's not where I want to be. Sorry. Try that again. This is maybe putting the cart before the horse. Okay. This is from the movie Amadeus, and this is perhaps not completely accurate, and we will not watch the whole thing, but Mozart is on his deathbed, he's dying. And the composer Salieri, who has been his mortal enemy this whole time, comes along and helps him write part of his Requiem Mass as Mozart dictates it to him. This did not actually happen in actual life, but it is a really interesting scene, and it kind of shows you how everything fits together.
Translate that. In time.
Okay, you can play now, it's okay, you can do that.
Where did I stop?
Devo ricordare. Statuenza in
So
Apprec.
now, computatus maledictus. Would you translate that?
Inside the flames of war.
You believe in
What?
fire which never dies, burning forever.
Oh, yeah.
Possible. We ended in F major.
Yes.
So now, A minor. A minor.
Yes. Confutatis. A minor.
So they're bringing in all the instruments in the
voices.
score.
Bass is first. Second beat of the first.
Time.
Common time. second beat of the first measure. On A. It is second measure, second beat. It is, you see,
It's just G sharp.
of course. Second beat of the third measure, on E. My sacrifice rest. My deities, my sacrifice deities. You have it. So show me. Now the 10. Fourth beat, the first measure on C. Second measure, fourth beat, D.
So you can see the imitation
Yes,
there.
yes. Second beat of the
The
fourth measure
sequence.
on F. Now the orchestra, second bassoon and bass trombones with the basses, identical notes and rhythm. First bassoon, tenor trombones with the tenors. Do you have it? It's not too bad. Do you have it? First bassoon, tenor trombone, what? With the tenors.
Difficult.
Of course, the instruments doubling the voices. Now, trumpets in timpani, trumpets in D.
No,
Listen to me.
I don't understand.
Listen. Trumpets in D, tonic and dominant, first and third beats. It goes with a harmony.
Yes, yes, yes. No. Yes. Yes, I understand. Yes, yes. And that's all.
No, no, not with a real fire. Strings in unison, ostinato on A, like this. Next measures rise.
Yes, 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 I understand.
Yes, go on. Go come in.
Okay, I would like to watch the rest of that, but I'm not going to. We're gonna move on, but that kind of shows how they would put it all together. And how they would use imitation and sequence to outline things and to make things more prominent. Mozart did not finish his Requiem Mass before he passed away. He did die with it unfinished. Some of his students came along and finished it for him posthumously. But it stands as as probably his crowning achievement in sacred music. Again, he would have made a lot of money as an opera composer had he survived, but he died young. The second movement of a classical symphony is theme and variations, where you take a musical idea and then you change it. This is it's in an andante or adagio tempo, so not very fast, and it's an ABA form. So theme, variation, and return to the original theme. Haydn's Surprise Symphony is very well known. The Surprise Symphony is called the Surprise Symphony because it starts out very soft and almost lullaby-like, and then he strikes a very loud fortissimo chord. The work is nicknamed Surprise because of the sudden fortissimo, which is super loud, crashing chord in the slow movement, which was intended to startle people in the audience if they had fallen asleep. You know, if you go and you have a big dinner and then you go to sit down and you listen to Haydn's symphony, you may just feel a little bit drowsy. He didn't like people falling asleep. during his new music, so he wrote the surprise symphony to wake them all up. I don't know if we actually have that. We do. So let's hear a little bit of the surprise symphony. Listen for the surprise chord. So it starts out piano, soft. And then we repeat that, even softer. I assure you it is still playing. And that's when everybody falls out of their chair. So the counter melody is the variation here. Now we're going back to the A section with the variation. It was very soft, and now it's in a minor key, and it's louder. Remember how we said that this was like a conversation? You're kind of hear the string section talking to one another. So there's the A theme, but he's using shorter notes. Here's the secondary theme. Here he sticks on a coda again. Coda is Italian for tail. When I give my dog a treat, he wags his coda. It uses material from the A section. You can always count on Haydn to be graceful. So that was the theme and variations, the second movement. And the third movement is a minuet, which we're not going to hear. But remember, the third movement was usually the dance movement. It starts out with fast, it goes to slower, then it goes to dance movement if you have a third movement, and then it ends with fast again. Okay, I think we will stop there for this evening. So we'll pick it up with Mozart and chamber music next time. So what you need to do on Quizzitive is Prelude 4, Music with Order and Logic, and chapters 31 and 32. So these three for next time. Now those will be averaged. Your scores on these three will be averaged into one score. Okay, so if you only do these two, I'm still gonna average it with all three. So be sure you do all three. Sometimes people only do one or two and they don't do all three, and then that will bring your score down even if you did well here. So be sure you do all three. They don't take a real long time to do. So Prelude 4, chapter 31, and chapter 32 for next time. And then we'll finish off. Well, we may not make it all the way through because there's a lot of classicism. It may take us more than one class to do that. Okay, so that is for next week. Remember, if you are watching the recording, we gave the code word earlier, so be sure to email that to me by noon next Monday. And if you have any questions, let me know. If not, I will see you next week.